The weight of the world on her shoulders. The muted hum of the early morning filled the cramped apartment, a soft chorus of sounds too familiar to need acknowledgement. The kettle whistled faintly on the stove. Water ran in short, hurried bursts from the faucet as dishes clinked together. And through it all, the rhythmic coughs from the bedroom punctuated the air like a sad metronome. Janelle Porter sat on the edge of the pull-out couch, her bare feet brushing the cold floor, a tremble in her hands as she clutched her phone. 5:42 a.m. Too early for the exhaustion already tightening her chest. The suit hung by the window, a size too big, its shoulders sagging like it already expected her defeat. "Janelle, honey, you need to eat something." Her mother's voice, soft but urgent, carried from the kitchen. Gloria Porter stood by the counter in her pale blue nurse's scrubs, adjusting the hemline while her toast sat neglected on a chipped plate. Big day today. Janelle didn't answer right away. Her fingers skimmed over the folded eviction notice still sitting on the coffee table, a paper she knew too well by now. Final notice. Court appearance mandatory. Failure to comply will result in forcible removal. The legal jargon twisted like barbed wire in her chest. "I'll eat at the courthouse," Janelle murmured, voice hoarse from sleep or fear. Maybe both. Her mother's worn sneakers squeaked against the scuffed linoleum as she crossed the room and knelt in front of her daughter. Gloria's hands, rough from years of scrubbing hospital floors and bathing strangers, cupped Janelle's face. "You are stronger than this piece of paper," she said, voice low but firm. "You hear me?" Janelle nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Behind them, her father stirred in the bedroom. The once strong man who had lifted her onto his shoulders at the park now lay fragile, skin like parchment, breath labored. Medical bills stacked higher than hope. And now this, the eviction hearing. One setback after another, until the cracks in their life had become chasms. "Do you want me to come with you?" Gloria asked, though they both knew the answer. Gloria's morning shift at the nursing home couldn't be missed, not if they wanted to keep the lights on another month. Janelle forced a smile. "You've got enough to worry about." The hug they shared was brief but fierce, a wordless promise between mother and daughter. When Gloria left, the doors locked clicking softly behind her, the apartment seemed to exhale a weary breath. The suit belonged to Mrs. Evers' daughter, a neighbor from down the hall who'd made it to a decent office job before moving out. It was a little too long in the sleeves, a little too tight at the waist, but it was better than the faded hoodie Janelle usually wore. She stood before the bathroom mirror, trying to smooth her hair into something professional, though the curls fought her at every turn. "You look smart," her father's voice rasped from the bedroom doorway. Janelle turned, startled to see him standing there, leaning heavily on the doorframe, his hospital wristband still around his frail wrist. "You should be resting." He smiled, though it was the kind of smile that came through pain. "My little girl, going to court. Fighting for this family." His voice cracked. "I'm proud of you." Tears threatened to spill, but Janelle blinked them back. "I won't let them take our home." "You never let anyone push you around," he said. "Not even that math teacher who said you'd never pass algebra." Janelle let out a soft laugh, remembering how she'd stayed after school every day until she proved him wrong. But this felt bigger, more like standing at the edge of a cliff. Her father's coughing fit shook his whole body, doubling him over. Janelle rushed to his side, guiding him back to bed. The oxygen tank hissed faintly beside him, a reminder of how fragile everything was. The walk to the courthouse felt like walking through molasses, each step dragged by the weight of the folder in her hands, a thin defense against the legal storm waiting inside. Copies of rent receipts, her father's medical records, doctors' letters explaining how the missed payments weren't neglect, just survival. Every page was proof they were human, even if the court preferred them faceless. The courthouse stood ahead, tall and gray, its windows glaring back at her like judgmental eyes. She hesitated at the foot of the stairs, swallowing the fear threatening to choke her. Lawyers swept past her, their suits sharp, their briefcases heavy with confidence. Janelle's palms grew damp against the folder, but she kept climbing. Inside, the air was thick with old wood and stale coffee. The floor-to-ceiling windows let in slashes of light that cut through the gloom, but the place still felt suffocating. People filled the benches, some nervous like her, others bored like this was just another item on their to-do list. "Porter eviction case," the clerk said, not even glancing up from her screen. "Table to the left." The table felt too big, too empty, as Janelle sat down and spread out her papers. The lawyer for the building owners, a man in a sleek navy suit and a permanent smirk, was already there, his briefcase pristine and his gaze dismissive. "All rise." The words hit like a gunshot, making Janelle jump. Judge Richard Penbrook strode in, black robes flowing, his thin lips pressed into a line of permanent disapproval. His gray hair was combed back with military precision, and the gold watch on his wrist gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Janelle stood, heart thudding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. The judge sat, and everyone followed. He flipped open the docket, his eyes scanning down the list before settling on her name. A faint flicker of something crossed his face. Recognition, amusement, before it vanished beneath cold indifference. "Miss Porter," he drawled, peering over the rim of his glasses. "You're representing yourself." "Yes, Your Honor," Janelle said, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be. Penbrook's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's bold." The lawyer for the landlord smirked. Janelle's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin up. "Proceed," the judge said with a dismissive wave, as if she was a child asked to explain why her homework was late. Janelle stood, clutching the edges of the table to steady herself. Her palms were sweaty, and her notes suddenly seemed jumbled. "Your Honor," she began, "my family has lived in that apartment for over 15 years. My father has been sick, and the medical bills." Penbrook raised a hand, silencing her. "Miss Porter, the court isn't here to listen to sob stories. We're here to establish whether your family paid the rent." Janelle's hands shook as she flipped to the receipts. "We did, Your Honor. We fell behind only after my father was hospitalized." The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. "And you expect the court to believe that excuses months of delinquency?" "It's not an excuse," Janelle said, voice stronger now. "It's a reason. There are laws that protect tenants in hardship." Penbrook cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Spare me the community center legal talk." Laughter rippled through the courtroom, but it wasn't the kind Janelle remembered from her school talent shows. This was cruel, the kind meant to remind her of exactly where she stood. She gripped the table tighter, tears threatening but held at bay. This wasn't just about one case, she realized. It was about who deserved to be heard, and who the system preferred to silence. And from the back row, unseen by Janelle, a man shifted forward in his seat, his sharp eyes locked on Penbrook, his jaw tightening with every word. He hadn't come here for this case, but now he couldn't look away. Justice had been asleep for a long time, but it was waking up. Echoes in the courtroom. The fluorescent lights hummed with quiet menace, casting a sterile glare over the courtroom as Janelle gripped the edges of the defendant's table, her knuckles white with tension. The cheap pen she'd borrowed from her mother's kitchen drawer rested beside her crumpled notes, its ink already smudged from her nervous fingers. Every time she looked up, she found Judge Richard Penbrook watching her, not with professional detachment, but with the faintest curl of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth, like he was already bored with her. The clerk shuffled papers without looking up. The building's attorney, with his perfect suit and polished shoes, leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, his smirk matching the judge's. They were part of the same machine, Janelle realized, the same system built to grind people like her into silence. Her voice had trembled when she introduced herself, but she refused to let it break again. Her father's face was seared into her mind. Pale, sunken, still trying to smile when she'd left that morning. Her mother's hug, fierce and wordless. They had no one but her. "Miss Porter," Penbrook said again, his voice cutting into her thoughts like a blade. This court isn't interested in personal hardships. We're here to discuss facts, whether or not you and your family failed to pay rent. Janelle swallowed, her throat tight. Your Honor, the circumstances matter. My father's medical emergency. He waved a hand in the air. That's irrelevant. No, it's not, Janelle said, surprising even herself with the sudden firmness in her voice. The law protects tenants facing financial hardship due to medical emergencies. I have the documentation. She flipped open her folder, hands shaking slightly as she held up hospital bills, doctor's letters, and a timeline showing how every missed payment correlated with her father's hospitalization. The stack of paper looked so small compared to the briefcase the landlord's lawyer had placed neatly on the table. Pembroke didn't even glance at the papers. This is not some community outreach seminar, he said sharply. This is a courtroom. And frankly, Miss Porter, I've seen enough of these cases to know exactly how they go. People like you. The words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. People like you. Janelle felt the heat rise in her face, shame mixing with fury. People like her. What did that even mean? People who lived in apartments with peeling paint and broken radiators. People who rode 2 buses to school and prayed the power bill could wait another week. People who walked into rooms like this and were dismissed before they even spoke. Her hands clenched the edges of the table, and she forced her voice steady. I'm not asking for favors, Your Honor. I'm asking for fairness. Pembroke chuckled, low and condescending. Fairness? Life isn't fair, Miss Porter. Maybe someone should have told you that before you showed up here playing dress-up. A ripple of laughter echoed from the landlord's side of the room. Even the clerk smirked behind her hand. Janelle's vision blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from sheer rage. The edges of the room seemed to tilt, her ears ringing with the humiliating echo of their laughter. She wanted to scream, to fling her papers across the room and walk out, but she couldn't. Not when her father's oxygen tank sat hissing beside his bed. Not when her mother had kissed her forehead that morning and whispered, "We believe in you." Her nails dug into her palms, deep crescent moons left behind, but she stood her ground. There are laws protecting tenants from retaliatory evictions, she said, her voice loud enough to echo, even if it shook. We have proof our landlord refused to make repairs and then tried to evict us after we reported him to the housing authority. Pembroke leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his bench, unimpressed. Do you even understand what evidence means, Miss Porter? Because so far, I'm seeing a lot of paper and not much else. Janelle's stomach churned, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not now. It's all in here, she said, her voice hoarse but determined. Payment records, medical documentation, repair requests, even letters from our neighbors confirming the conditions. He sighed loudly, as though her words were a personal inconvenience. I think we've wasted enough of the court's time. The gavel was already half raised when a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. Not so fast, Your Honor. The room shifted, heads turning in unison toward the gallery's back row. An older man, his presence commanding despite his worn suit, stood with both hands resting heavily on the cane before him. His skin was the deep brown of someone who had marched in more than one protest, who had stood in more than one courtroom where the odds were stacked against him. Who are you, sir? Pembroke asked, though his expression flickered, recognition or perhaps unease. The man's voice was steady, with the kind of weight that comes from decades of knowing exactly what to say and exactly when to say it. Name's Lewis Carter, he said, his gaze unwavering. I've seen a lot of courtrooms, Your Honor, and I've seen a lot of judges who think they can get away with turning this place into their personal fiefdom. Janelle blinked, her mind racing. Who was this man? She'd never seen him before, but there was something about the way he stood, solid, unshakable, like roots dug deep into the earth. Mr. Carter, Pembroke said, his smile thin and forced. This is highly irregular. No more irregular than the way you're treating this girl, Lewis said calmly, though there was iron beneath his tone. "I came here to watch today, just to see how much things have changed since I retired." He paused, letting the silence settle heavy over the room. "Turns out, not much." Janelle's heart thudded in her chest. There was no applause, no cheers, but the energy in the room had shifted, the smirks wiped from faces, the courtroom holding its collective breath. "Miss Porter deserves a fair hearing," Lewis continued, without the commentary, without the condescension, and without the bias. Penbrook's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the bench a fraction tighter. "This is my courtroom." "No," Lewis corrected. "This is the people's courtroom." The words landed like a slap, and for the first time, the judge didn't immediately have a reply. The silence felt different now, not awkward, but charged. The weight of something larger than one eviction case hung in the air. Penbrook's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "We'll take a brief recess." Janelle sank into her chair, breathless, unsure if she was more relieved or terrified. Lewis Carter moved slowly down the aisle, each step deliberate, his cane tapping against the floor. He stopped beside her table, meeting her eyes. His voice softened. "You're not alone, kid." Janelle couldn't speak. She could only nod, her throat too tight with the sudden weight of gratitude and disbelief. As Lewis moved toward the hallway, Penbrook's eyes followed him, a flicker of something, fear, maybe, or anger, crossing his face. Janelle didn't know what would happen when the recess ended, but she knew one thing with certainty. The judge's assumption that no one would stand up for her had just been shattered, and somewhere deep inside her, hope stirred. The weight of names and shadows. The corridor outside the courtroom was colder than Janelle expected, the kind of cold that wasn't just from the building's air conditioning, but from the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. The bench where she sat felt hard beneath her hands still trembling slightly from the confrontation that had just unfolded inside. Lewis Carter stood a few feet away, leaning against the wall, one hand resting on the carved head of his cane. His face was weathered, lines tracing stories that would probably take days to tell. His posture was still strong, though, like a tree that had been through every storm and was still standing. His eyes, deep and dark, seemed to see through her, past her nerves and into the place where her resolve still flickered. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been in the courtroom, but no less steady. Janelle nodded, though her voice felt stuck in her throat. "Who are you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Lewis smiled, slow and patient, like someone who had been asked that many times. "Just an old man who's been in too many rooms like this," he said, "and seen too many young folks like you get steamrolled." His gaze slid to the closed courtroom door, and Janelle noticed the way his fingers tightened briefly on his cane. "But I knew your judge," he added, "a long time ago." Janelle sat up straighter. "You knew Judge Penbrook?" "Knew him before he was a judge," Lewis said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Knew him back when he was just Richard Penbrook, a baby-faced prosecutor with a taste for easy wins. And by easy, I mean cases where the defendants looked a lot like you." The weight of his words settled heavy between them. Janelle swallowed. "Why? Why did you speak up for me?" "Because no one did for me," Lewis said simply, "and because that man in there." He gestured toward the courtroom with his cane. "He's not just biased. He's dirty. Always has been. But back then, nobody listened to a black attorney trying to expose a white prosecutor." Janelle's mind spun, trying to piece together what he was saying. The judge's smirks, the quick dismissals, the sneering comments, they were personal, not just systemic, a pattern that went back years, maybe decades. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come back now?" Lewis's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because you reminded me what it looks like to fight, even when you're scared." He tapped the side of his head. "It's easy to get tired, to sit down and think you've done enough. But watching you stand up in there, shaking but still speaking, woke something up in me." The courtroom door creaked open, and the clerk poked her head out. "We're resuming." Janelle took a breath, her heart hammering, but Lewis's hand settled briefly on her shoulder. "You're not walking back in there alone," he said. It was such a simple sentence, but it wrapped around her like armor. Together, they stepped back into the courtroom. The air felt heavier now, the tension thick enough to touch. Judge Penbrook's smile was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper. His fingers drummed slowly against the bench, his eyes flickering between Janelle and Lewis. "We're back on record," he said, voice clipped. "And I'd like to remind the gallery that only parties directly involved in the case have standing to address the court." Lewis didn't sit in the gallery this time. He took a seat directly behind Janelle at the defendant's table. He said nothing, didn't need to. His presence spoke volumes. Janelle squared her shoulders, her heart still pounding, but her voice steadier when she spoke. "Your Honor, I'd like to present additional evidence demonstrating our landlord's failure to maintain habitable living conditions." She slid a new stack of photos across the table, cracks in the ceiling, water damage left unfixed, the mold creeping up from the baseboards in the bathroom. All ignored complaints, all leading up to the eviction notice the day after her mother had filed a formal complaint with the city's housing authority. Penbrook barely glanced at them. "Miss Porter, I already told you." "The law is clear," Janelle interrupted, her voice rising. "Tenants have a right to safe living conditions, and landlords can't retaliate against tenants for filing legitimate complaints." Penbrook's smile returned, sharp and cruel. "You seem very confident for someone without a law degree." Janelle's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "I read the law, Your Honor. I didn't need a degree to understand it." The landlord's lawyer stood, hands clasped behind his back, his voice smooth and condescending. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the defendant's reliance on Google searches and community center pamphlets hardly qualifies as a credible legal argument." Janelle's cheeks burned, but before she could respond, Lewis leaned forward, his voice carrying like a thunderclap. "That's enough." Every head in the room turned. Lewis stood, his cane tapping against the floor as he moved to the front of the room. "If the court would allow a brief introduction," he said, "my name is Lewis Carter, former civil rights attorney, member of the State Bar since 1971, and I'd be happy to serve as Miss Porter's advisor for the remainder of these proceedings." Penbrook's face turned a mottled shade of red. "You're retired, Mr. Carter." "Not disbarred," Lewis said with a smile, though there was steel beneath it. "Just old." The landlord's lawyer stammered, caught off guard, but Penbrook's jaw set like stone. "This is highly irregular." "So is mocking a tenant in open court," Lewis replied. "Yet here we are." The gallery shifted, whispers rippling through the room. Janelle could barely breathe, watching the old man who had emerged like a ghost from the past suddenly stand between her and the full force of the system trying to crush her. "Proceed," Penbrook finally snapped, the veins in his neck pulsing. Lewis sat beside Janelle, smoothing his tie with deliberate calm. "We'll be fine," he murmured. "He's bluffing." The next hour was a blur of objections and evidence. Lewis guided her, helping her frame her arguments, cutting through the jargon Penbrook and the landlord's lawyer used to confuse her. With Lewis's help, her case transformed from a desperate plea into a clear, fact-based argument. Each time Penbrook tried to interrupt, Lewis would raise a hand, polite but unyielding. "She has the floor, Your Honor." The balance in the room shifted, inch by inch. By the time closing arguments approached, Janelle's hands had stopped shaking. She stood, her voice firm, her papers in perfect order. "We're not asking for special treatment," she said. "We're asking for fairness, for the law to apply to us the same way it applies to everyone else." She paused, letting her words settle. "This isn't just about my family. It's about every tenant who's been threatened into silence because they couldn't afford a lawyer." The silence that followed was different this time, not dismissive, but heavy with meaning. Penbrook's face was unreadable, but his grip on his gavel was tight. Lewis nodded once, approval clear in his eyes. The hearing adjourned, but the battle wasn't over. In the hallway, Janelle stood beside Louis, her heart still racing. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled, weary but proud. "Don't thank me yet, kid." His gaze drifted to the far end of the hall, where Pembroke's office door stood slightly ajar. This was round one. The ghosts in the walls. The courthouse hallway was quieter after the hearing ended, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that hummed beneath the surface, the kind that existed when something heavy was shifting just out of sight. Janelle stood beside Louis, her fingers curled tightly around the edges of her file folder, the paper inside worn at the corners from hours of anxious handling. Her palms were damp, her heartbeat still trying to catch up with the fire that had burned through her closing argument. For the first time since walking into that courtroom, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Louis leaned on his cane, not saying much, just standing beside her, a quiet wall of support. She was still trying to process everything. How the old man who'd saved her from Pembroke's public humiliation was now acting as her unofficial advisor. How he'd faced off with the judge like he'd been waiting years for it. "What happens now?" Janelle finally asked. Louis' lips twitched in something close to a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Now," he tapped his cane twice against the marble floor. "Now, we prepare for war." Janelle's stomach twisted. "You really think it's going to get that bad?" Louis' gaze slid past her, toward the far end of the hall where the judge's chambers stood. The frosted glass door was cracked slightly open, and though Pembroke wasn't visible, the weight of his presence filled the air like a bad smell. "Men like him," Louis said quietly, "they don't forget being challenged. And they don't forgive it." The gravity in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "But you said you knew him before." "Oh, I knew him," Louis said, eyes narrowing. "We stood on opposite sides of the same courtroom more than once." Janelle frowned. "What happened?" Louis exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries years. "I tried to expose him back then. Thought I could prove how he rigged cases, especially when black defendants were involved. It wasn't just bias, it was calculated. But no one wanted to hear it. They called me bitter. Angry. They said I was playing the race card." Janelle's throat tightened. It was too familiar. "What did he do to you?" Louis' fingers tapped the top of his cane, rhythmic and steady. "He buried me." It was said so casually, but Janelle felt the weight of it. "How?" "Discredited me. Turned my own words against me in a smear campaign. Said I was incompetent, unprofessional. Planted stories in the papers about my radical views. I was toxic by the end of it. Lost cases before I even opened my mouth." "Why didn't anyone help you?" Janelle's voice cracked slightly. "Because back then, the system wasn't built to listen to people like me," Louis said softly. "Still isn't, really. But times change. People like you make it harder for men like Pembroke to hide." Janelle felt the enormity of what Louis was saying, how her fight wasn't just about her family's eviction anymore. It was about all the people Pembroke had steamrolled, all the families who had been silenced because they couldn't afford lawyers or because they were black or brown in a system where justice wore a white face. "He's going to come after me, isn't he?" Janelle asked quietly. Louis met her gaze. "Yes," he said simply, "but you're not alone this time." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Janelle and Louis descended together, the weight of the day pressing down on both of them. The sky was clear, but the air felt heavy, like something was brewing far above where they could see. "What do we do now?" Janelle asked as they reached the sidewalk. Louis' smile was small and sharp. "We dig. Dig. Into Pembroke," Louis said. "You think you're the first person he's railroaded in that courtroom. There's a trail, and we're going to follow it." The idea felt overwhelming, but there was something solid about Louis' certainty, like this was personal for him, not just helping Janelle, but finally settling an old debt. Janelle nodded. "Where do we start?" Louis' eyes glinted. "With the cases he thought everyone forgot." They started at the public records office, where the clerk barely glanced up from her phone as Louis asked for case files from the 1990s. Janelle sat beside him, watching as folder after folder was placed on the counter. Thin, faded files that still held the weight of entire lives inside them. Penbrook was a prosecutor back then, Louis explained quietly. Specialized in low-income cases, housing disputes, minor criminal offenses, anything where people couldn't afford a real defense. Janelle flipped through the first folder, her fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The defendant was a black single mother, accused of defrauding her landlord by withholding rent after her heat had been shut off in the dead of winter. Penbrook had pressed for the harshest penalty, calling her a professional victim in his closing argument. Her stomach turned. "Here," Louis said, sliding another folder toward her. Same pattern. Tenant makes a legitimate complaint. Penbrook turns it into a criminal case. Even when the evidence was on their side, they lost. Why? Janelle asked. Why would he care that much about evictions? Louis' smile was bitter. Because back then, Penbrook had friends. Developers. Landlords. The kind who make campaign donations. You make their problems disappear. They make your future bright. They worked for hours, the sunlight slowly shifting to dusk, the office lights flickering on above them. Each file told the same story. Tenants of color, families with no money, cases twisted until they became crimes, and Penbrook always at the center, pushing for eviction, pressing for charges, always with that thin smile. By the time they left, Janelle's bag was stuffed with photocopies and notes. Her hands ached from writing, her mind spinning with the sheer scale of it. This wasn't just her family's story. It was hundreds of stories, stacked like bricks, forming the foundation of Penbrook's career. "You okay?" Louis asked as they stood outside. Janelle's throat was tight, but she nodded. "I'm mad." Louis grinned. "Good." The next morning, Janelle stood in her family's kitchen, the table covered with files and sticky notes, her mother hovering nearby with a worried frown. "What is all this?" her mother asked, her voice careful. "Proof," Janelle said quietly. "Proof that Penbrook's been doing this for decades." Her mother's eyes widened. "Baby, this is dangerous." "I know." Janelle's hands rested on the table, the paper beneath them trembling slightly. "But if we don't do it, he'll keep doing it. To us. To other families." Her mother didn't argue. Instead, she reached out and squeezed Janelle's hand. "You're braver than I ever was." Janelle shook her head. "I'm just tired of being scared." There was a knock at the door, and Janelle's stomach flipped. Louis stood there, holding a battered leather folder, his expression serious. "I found something," he said. They sat at the table together, Louis carefully opening the folder. Inside were copies of old letters, signed affidavits from former court clerks, some so old the paper had yellowed. One stood out. "Penbrook's old clerk," Louis said. He swore that Penbrook altered case files before sending them to the judge. Janelle's eyes widened. "That's illegal." "And if we can prove it," Louis said, "it's the end of Penbrook." The weight of it settled over her like a second skin. This wasn't just a fight for her family's apartment anymore. This was a reckoning. Digging up ghosts. The sound of papers rustling filled the small kitchen, overlapping with the faint wheeze of Janelle's father's breathing from the bedroom. Janelle's hands shook as she spread the newly discovered affidavits across the table. The weight of those brittle pages was heavier than it should have been, each one a relic of injustice, each signature a silent scream that no one had ever heard. Her mother sat across from her, arms folded tightly, worry creasing her brow as her eyes skimmed the documents. "You're telling me this judge has been doing this for decades, and nobody stopped him?" "Nobody wanted to," Louis said from his spot near the window, where he leaned heavily on his cane, watching the street below with the air of someone who expected trouble. "Back then, you didn't cross someone like Richard Penbrook unless you were prepared to pay for it." "Pay how?" Janelle asked, even though she was already starting to understand. Reputation, Lewis said, tapping the handle of his cane absently. Career. Family. Whatever it took. Janelle's stomach churned. So, what happens when we go public with this? Lewis gave her a sidelong glance. He'll come for you. The words hit like a cold slap. She'd known this was dangerous, but hearing Lewis say it so plainly made it real in a way that hadn't quite settled in before. Pembroke wasn't just an unfair judge. He was a man who had built an entire career on burying people like her under paperwork, lies, and ruined reputations. She glanced at the framed photo of her family on the wall, the one from her middle school graduation when her dad was still strong enough to stand without help, his arm draped proudly over her shoulder. Everything they had, every scrap of dignity they'd managed to hold on to, was at stake. But there was no going back. We still need more, Lewis said, breaking the silence. The affidavits are a start, but if we want to bring him down, we need something undeniable. Like what? Janelle asked. Lewis smiled grimly. We need his paper trail. The next day, they made their way to a building that felt more like a tomb than a repository, a records office tucked into a corner of City Hall, where documents went to be forgotten. Rows of metal shelves stretched toward the ceiling, each one sagging under the weight of file boxes labeled with years and case numbers. The clerk barely looked up when they walked in, but Lewis' presence changed that quickly. His name still carried weight in some corners, and after a few minutes of polite but pointed conversation, they were left alone with a card of files labeled Pembroke, Evictions, 1992 to 2010. Janelle pulled the first box onto the table, her fingers tracing the faded label. How many people did he hurt? Lewis didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the first file and laid it flat. The pages inside were thin, worn down from decades of handling, but the stories they told were as sharp as ever. Tenant complaints dismissed without hearings. Landlord affidavits copied and pasted from one case to the next. Names crossed out, but the circumstances always the same. Mold, no heat, harassment, eviction. Hundreds, Lewis said finally. Maybe more. Janelle's throat tightened as she flipped through the papers. It wasn't just paperwork, it was lives. Families split apart, children uprooted, elders left homeless, and all of it swept into boxes and filed away like none of it ever mattered. But it did matter. We need proof that he altered records, Lewis said, moving to the next box. Something we can link directly to him. It was painstaking work. Hours spent comparing original filings with final court orders, looking for discrepancies, annotations, anything that showed Pembroke's hand in shaping outcomes before hearings even started. It was in the third box that Janelle found it. Look at this. She held up two versions of the same case file, one from the tenant's initial filing, the other from the court's official record. This isn't just a typo. The tenant's original request for emergency repairs is gone in the court copy. It makes it look like they never even complained. Lewis leaned over, studying both documents closely. This handwriting. He pointed to a small, cramped note scrawled in the margin of the court copy. That's Pembroke's. How do you know? Janelle asked. Lewis didn't smile this time. Because I sat across from him when he wrote it, back when I was still young enough to believe truth mattered more than power. Janelle's pulse pounded in her ears. This could prove he tampered with records. Lewis nodded. It's a start. By the time they left, Janelle's bag was so full of photocopies it barely zipped shut. The weight of it hung heavy on her shoulder as they stepped out into the fading evening light. Lewis stood beside her, his cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk. Why are you doing this? Janelle asked suddenly, the question bursting out before she could stop it. You don't even know me. Lewis' gaze softened just for a moment. I know your fight, he said quietly. I've fought it my whole life, and I know what it feels like to think you're the only one in the world who cares. He glanced toward the horizon, where the sky bled from orange to deep purple. I let Pembroke beat me once. I'm not letting him do it again." The fierceness in his voice made Janelle stand a little straighter. For all her fear, all her doubt, she wasn't standing alone anymore. The next morning, it started. The smear campaign. Janelle's phone buzzed with notifications before she even got out of bed. The first article was on a local legal blog, a vague piece about baseless accusations against a respected judge. Then came the social media posts, the anonymous accounts calling her an entitled brat-playing lawyer, accusing her family of being professional victims looking for a payout. The worst was the news clip. There was Pembroke, sitting behind his desk, his face carefully arranged into an expression of disappointed patience. "It's unfortunate," he said smoothly, "that some people would resort to personal attacks and conspiracy theories when the law simply doesn't go their way." Janelle's stomach twisted into knots as she watched him frame himself as the victim. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was calm, measured, like a man who knew the system was built to protect him. Her mother stood behind her, watching over her shoulder. "Baby, we can stop," she said softly. "We can find another place. We'll figure it out." Janelle shook her head. "If we stop now, he wins." Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Louis. "Keep your head up. Truth takes time. Lies spread fast, but they fall apart under pressure." Janelle took a deep breath, her hands shaking, but her spine straightening. "We fight." Her mother's fingers brushed her shoulder, gentle but firm. "Then we fight." That night, Janelle sat at the kitchen table, the files spread before her like a map of pain. But this time, the weight didn't feel like hers alone. It belonged to every family in those pages, every voice Pembroke had silenced. She wouldn't stop until they were all heard. From his office across town, Judge Pembroke stared at his screen, his smile thin. The smear campaign had started, but something gnawed at him, a cold sliver of fear. Because somewhere out there, Louis Carter was digging. And this time, he wasn't digging alone. When the walls come crashing down, the morning light spilled across Janelle's kitchen table, illuminating the battlefield of documents. Legal pads and coffee-stained sticky notes spread across the scared wood. Her fingers traced the edges of the photocopies Louis had helped her dig up. The proof, the patterns, the unmistakable fingerprints of Judge Richard Pembroke, scattered across decades of ruined lives. The smear campaign hadn't slowed. If anything, it had intensified. Social media posts painted her as a manipulative girl chasing her 15 minutes of fame, twisting her family's eviction into a spectacle. Anonymous emails flooded her inbox, threats, slurs, warnings to stay in her place. But the threats didn't shake her. They hardened her. At 7:42 a.m., Louis' name flashed across her phone screen. His voice, gravelly with years of smoke and courtroom battles, came through steady and clear. "Today's the day, kid." Janelle's stomach flipped. "Are you sure we're ready?" "No," Louis said, with that dry humor that had become his signature. "But we don't have time to wait for perfect. We have what we need." Janelle turned toward her mother, who stood at the counter stirring oatmeal, her brow creased with both pride and worry. "Are you sure you want to come?" Janelle asked softly. Her mother wiped her hands on a dish towel, setting it down with quiet finality. "Baby, I've spent my whole life swallowing my pride because I thought it was the only way to survive. Not today." Her father, too weak to leave bed, gave Janelle a small nod from the doorway. "You make them see us," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "Make them see all of us." Janelle hugged him, inhaling the faint scent of his aftershave, one of the few things illness hadn't taken from him. Then she picked up her worn folder, its corners bent from overuse, and followed Louis down the hall. This time, they weren't going to court to play defense. They were going to war. The courthouse steps were crowded when they arrived. Reporters milled about, their cameras already trained on the doors. The smear campaign had drawn attention, but Louis and Janelle had made sure the real story was ready to break wide open. In her hands was a copy of the Carter-Porter report, an exhaustive dossier documenting Penbrook's history of judicial misconduct, racial bias, and evidence tampering. Lewis' name gave it weight. Janelle's story gave it heart. They stepped through the revolving doors, past security, and into the cold marble hallway. The air was thick with tension, lawyers and clerks whispering in tight knots, glancing toward the double doors at the end of the hall. Judge Penbrook's courtroom. "Think he knows," Janelle whispered. "Oh, he knows," Lewis said. "And that's what makes this so sweet." The hearing wasn't for Janelle's eviction case anymore. It was a disciplinary review, a formal investigation into Judge Penbrook's fitness to remain on the bench. The Judicial Conduct Oversight Board had convened after receiving Lewis and Janelle's evidence, along with corroborating testimony from former clerks, tenants, and even a few attorneys who had been too afraid to speak out until now. The panel sat at the front of the courtroom, 3 judges with decades of combined experience, none of whom looked particularly pleased to be there. Judge Penbrook sat alone at a table, his usual smug confidence replaced with thinly veiled rage. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Janelle took her seat beside Lewis, her mother in the row directly behind them. The room was packed, not just with reporters, but with families who had once been faceless names in Penbrook's docket. They had come to see if justice was possible. "All parties ready?" the senior panel judge asked. Lewis stood, his cane steady beneath his hand. "Ready." Penbrook's lawyer, a man so polished he practically gleamed, stood with equal confidence. "We are, Your Honor." The opening was clinical. The panel judge reading the formal charges, a litany of abuses so long it made Janelle's stomach churn: manipulation of court records, racial bias, improper ex parte communication with landlords, retaliatory rulings against tenants who filed complaints. But it wasn't until Janelle stood to give her statement that the room's energy shifted. She walked to the witness stand, her heart hammering so hard it echoed in her ears, but she stood straight. Her borrowed suit had been replaced with one that fit her perfectly, no longer a girl playing dress-up. "My name is Janelle Porter," she said, her voice clear. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an activist. I'm just someone who got tired of being treated like my family didn't matter." She told them everything. The broken heat, the mold, the ignored complaints, her father's illness, the eviction notice, and the day she stood in this very room, while Penbrook mocked her for daring to believe the law might apply to her family too. "But this isn't just my story," Janelle said, turning slightly to face the gallery. "It's their story." She gestured to the families sitting behind her, the faces from those old case files, the people whose lives had been shattered in this courtroom. "We were just names on paper to him. Easy cases, easy wins, but we're not paper. We're people." Penbrook's lawyer objected, some procedural nonsense, but the lead judge silenced him with a glance. "Please continue, Miss Porter." Janelle placed the Carter-Porter report on the evidence table. This document tracks 25 years of cases overseen by Judge Penbrook. It shows a clear pattern of racial bias, evidence tampering, and rulings consistently favoring landlords with financial ties to his campaigns. She took a breath. This isn't about one eviction. This is about a system that was rigged from the start. The silence that followed was deafening. Penbrook took the stand, but the damage had already been done. His denials sounded hollow, his explanations too rehearsed. When Lewis cross-examined him, there was no grandstanding, just quiet, relentless precision. Every piece of evidence, every alteration, every whispered threat Penbrook had ever issued was laid bare. "You thought you could bury me," Lewis said softly at the end, his voice like gravel over stone. "But you forgot something, Richard." Penbrook sneered. "What's that?" Lewis smiled. "Seeds grow in dirt." The panel's ruling came faster than anyone expected. Richard Penbrook was formally removed from the bench. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning, and the pressure from the public, once Janelle and Lewis' report hit the news, too great to ignore. Janelle stood on the courthouse steps, sunlight streaming down, reporters' questions flying like arrows. "Miss Porter, how does it feel to bring down a judge?" She didn't smile. "It's not about bringing him down," she said. "It's about making sure no one else has to stand where I stood. Alone." She felt her mother's hand on her shoulder, strong and proud. Louis stood beside her, tired but satisfied. "You did good, kid," Louis said softly. "We did," Janelle corrected. Months later, Janelle sat at her kitchen table, her acceptance letter to law school open in front of her. Her father slept peacefully in the next room, his health still fragile but his smile brighter these days. Her mother hummed softly, cooking dinner with the windows open, sunlight spilling in like hope. Louis Kane leaned against the wall, a symbol of the fight they'd shared. Janelle knew she wouldn't stop, not with Pembroke, not with any of the others still sitting behind those benches, thinking they were untouchable. Because now, she knew the truth. When one voice speaks up, others find their courage. And justice, real justice, wasn't just in the law. It was in the fight.